It is the evening of June 23rd, 1942, and ground crews at RAF Pembrey in South Wales are finishing the routines of an ordinary day. Then a sound reaches them that does not belong on a British airfield. A deep, uneven growl, an engine that no Spitfire or Hurricane carries. Men look up and freeze. Banking calmly into the landing circuit is a fighter wearing the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. It is a Focke-Wulf 190, the exact aircraft that has spent the last several months tearing British fighter squadrons apart over the English Channel. And it is not under attack. It is not being chased down or escorted in by captors. It is simply lowering its landing gear as calmly as if it were coming home. What none of the men on the ground know yet is that this single aircraft is about to hand the Royal Air Force the answer to a problem they have been desperate to solve for almost a year. And what the German pilot climbing down from the cockpit does not know is that the moment his boots touch British tarmac, his war is over. But to understand exactly how strange this moment really is, we have to go back several months to a problem the British had absolutely no idea how to fix. By late 1941, the Focke-Wulf 190 had started appearing over occupied France, and almost immediately British Fighter Command had a crisis on its hands. The Spitfire Mark V, the aircraft that had carried the RAF through the Battle of Britain, was suddenly outmatched. The Focke-Wulf was faster. It could outdive the Spitfire with ease. It could outroll it in a way that left British pilots completely exposed mid-maneuver. Squadron after squadron came back from sweeps over France, having lost men to an enemy fighter nobody fully understood. The intelligence services needed one thing above everything else, an actual intact Focke-Wulf 190 they could take apart and study, and that was the one thing the Luftwaffe was determined never to give them. German pilots were under direct orders never to fly the aircraft anywhere near the English coast, specifically so that no wreckage and no intact example could ever fall into British hands. The risk of losing the secret was considered too dangerous to take. British planners grew so desperate that real proposals were drawn up to steal one, including a plan to send a German-speaking RAF pilot in a captured Messerschmitt, disguised as a Luftwaffe officer, straight on to a French airfield to simply demand a Focke-Wulf and fly it out. It sounds almost too reckless to be a genuine wartime plan, and it very nearly never needed to happen at all, because of what was about to take place over the Channel on a single summer evening.
That evening began with a dogfight, and the man at the center of it had no idea he was about to do British intelligence's job for them. His name was Oberleutnant Armin Faber, an experienced fighter pilot with 4 confirmed victories to his name, serving as Gruppenadjutant, essentially the administrative officer, for the 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader II, one of the Luftwaffe's most storied fighter wings, based at Morlaix in Brittany. On the afternoon of June 23rd, Faber requested and was given special permission to fly an operational sortie with the unit's 7th Squadron, the one actually equipped with the new Focke-Wulf 190s. His unit was scrambled to intercept a formation of British Boston bombers returning from a raid into France, escorted by Spitfires, flying out of squadrons near Exeter, including Polish and Czechoslovakian pilots serving with the RAF. What followed was fast, low, and violent, the kind of fight that where a single second of hesitation gets a pilot killed. In the chaos over the Channel, Faber became separated from the rest of his formation, and a Spitfire flown by a Czechoslovakian sergeant named František Traitnar latched onto him. Traitnar pressed the attack hard, and Faber found himself the one being hunted, fighting purely to survive. He threw the Focke-Wulf through a series of violent maneuvers, trying to shake the Spitfire off, flying north over Exeter as the fight dragged on. Then, with only one of his cannons still working, Faber pulled the aircraft up and over in a tight Immelmann turn directly into the glare of the sun, came out the other side facing his pursuer head-on, and fired. Traitnar's Spitfire took the hit and went down. He managed to bail out, though he came down with a shrapnel wound in his arm and a broken leg from the landing.
Faber had survived, but the fight had pulled him dangerously far from his squadron. His fuel was burning down fast, and the light was starting to fail. And here is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because what Faber did next is the single decision that decides everything that follows. Checking his compass to set a course back to France, Faber needed a heading of roughly 180 degrees, due south, toward his base in Brittany. What he actually flew was almost exactly the opposite, a heading near 360 degrees, due north. Pilots call this a reciprocal error, a documented and genuinely dangerous hazard of disorientation in combat flying, and it has happened to airmen on both sides of this war. In Faber's case, it sent him climbing steadily away from occupied France and straight toward the coast of Britain, and he had no idea. He flew on with his fuel gauge dropping, fully convinced he was minutes from home, and then he saw land ahead. To an exhausted pilot expecting the French coastline, it looked close enough. What he was actually looking at was the south coast of Wales. He had mistaken the Bristol Channel for the English Channel, and he was about to make a decision that would end his war in the next few minutes. Low on fuel, with no time left to second-guess himself, he scanned the ground for an airfield, found one, and began his approach, fully believing he was coming home to his own side.
The airfield was RAF Pembrey, home to the RAF's Air Gunnery School, a training station with no operational weapons posted on the field. Ground crews stopped dead as the aircraft banked overhead, the black crosses unmistakable even in the fading evening light. Faber waggled his wings as he came in and even pulled off a small victory roll, the standard way a pilot announced a kill to his own side, fully convinced he was signaling his squadron below. He lined up with the runway and brought the aircraft down cleanly, taxiing toward the dispersal area, exactly as he would have done on any ordinary evening in France. There were no anti-aircraft guns trained on that runway and no armed response team. What there was, according to the record, was one man, the duty pilot, a sergeant named Jeffries. Because Pembrey was a training station with nothing heavier on hand, Jeffries grabbed the only weapon available to him, a flare pistol, and ran straight out across the open tarmac toward a fully armed enemy fighter. He reached the aircraft as it was still rolling to a stop, climbed up onto the wing, and had the pistol on Faber before the engine had even finished winding down.
Faber slid back the canopy, expecting to see Luftwaffe mechanics. Instead, he was looking directly into the blue-grey uniform of the Royal Air Force and a flare gun pointed at his face. There was no struggle. According to the accounts that survive, the reality of what he had just done hit him almost immediately, and hit him hard. This was not simply embarrassment. Faber had just single-handedly handed Germany's most closely guarded aircraft to the enemy, and in the moments after his capture, he was reportedly so overcome by what he had done that he attempted to take his own life. The attempt failed, and he was taken into custody. It would not be the last time that day his life hung by chance. Faber was driven from Pembrey to RAF Fairwood Common for formal interrogation, under armed escort from a group captain named David Atcherley. Atcherley sat across from him for the entire journey with his service revolver drawn and aimed, taking no chances with a Luftwaffe officer who had just handed over the most valuable aircraft of the war. Part way through the drive, the car hit a pothole. The jolt was hard enough that the revolver discharged inside the vehicle. The shot missed Faber by inches. A man who had survived a dogfight, a navigational disaster, and his own attempt to end his life had now nearly been killed by accident on the way to be questioned.
For British intelligence, the aircraft itself was close to an unearned gift. It was a brand new production model, barely flown, completely intact, the first Focke-Wulf 190 to fall into Allied hands in this configuration. Within hours it had been secured and prepared to transport to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the heart of British aviation research. There was real urgency behind the secrecy, because if the Luftwaffe worked out what had happened, there was a genuine fear they might try to destroy the aircraft before British engineers could finish studying it. Test pilots were even asked whether the Focke-Wulf could simply be flown directly to Farnborough, but no one could guarantee it wouldn't be lost in transit, so in the end it was carefully dismantled and moved by road. It is worth pausing on one detail here, because it tends to come up whenever this story is told. Over the years, a few writers and historians have floated the idea that Faber's landing might not have been a pure accident at all, that a war-weary officer might have steered himself towards exactly this outcome. It is an interesting theory, but there is no real evidence behind it, and it sits more in the territory of speculation than established history. The reciprocal compass error, backed by Faber's own statements and the flight record, remains the explanation the evidence actually supports.
At Farnborough, engineers began tearing the aircraft apart to understand exactly why it had been winning so many fights. Some of what they found confirmed what RAF pilots already suspected from painful experience. The Focke-Wulf's ailerons ran on rigid pushrods rather than the stretching cables used in the Spitfire, giving it a noticeably faster roll rate, exactly the advantage British pilots had been losing to for months. But the testing also uncovered a weakness hiding inside the very aircraft that had been so dominant. Above roughly 20,000 feet, the Focke-Wulf's performance fell away sharply in the thinner air. At very high speeds, its controls became extremely heavy, slowing down exactly the kind of quick maneuvering that had made it so deadly closer to the ground. That discovery did not sit quietly in a research file. New tactical guidance went out to frontline RAF squadrons, built directly from what had been learned off this single captured aircraft, now flying in British markings under the designation MP499. Pilots were told never to try to outdive a Focke-Wulf 190, since it would simply run them down. Instead, draw the fight upward, into the altitude where the Spitfire still held the advantage, and rely on tight, sustained turns, rather than the rolling maneuvers where the German fighter excelled. It was not a miracle fix. The Focke-Wulf remained a dangerous aircraft for the rest of the war. But for the first time in months, British pilots had a real, tested answer to a threat that had been killing them since the previous autumn, an answer bought entirely by one pilot's broken sense of direction.
As for Armin Faber, his war ended on that Welsh tarmac. He spent the remainder of the conflict as a prisoner, and decades later, in 1991, he returned not to a battlefield, but to a small aviation museum near Shoreham, where he personally donated his officer's dagger and his pilot's badge, mementos of the single afternoon that had ended his war and changed the shape of the fight in the skies above the Channel. Step back from all of it, and what actually happened here is almost impossible to script. There was no spy, no sabotage, no successful commando raid. The single greatest piece of technical intelligence the RAF gained on its most dangerous airborne enemy of 1942 arrived because one disoriented pilot, alone over open water at the end of a brutal dogfight, read his compass backwards by exactly 180 degrees.
A war being fought with radar, with code breaking, with some of the most advanced engineering on either side, turned for one evening on something as small and as human as a tired man losing track of north and south, and a single sergeant brave enough to walk out onto a runway with nothing but a flare gun in his hand.